Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. And today we have a pretty miserable snowy day here in the Twin Cities. I don't know how many inches they're expecting, 6, 8. They've changed it repeatedly, but I tried to go to work and see, I got stuck 3 times in 2 miles. And got almost 20 miles to go. In that time I was tailgated by 4 different cars, 4 different Minnesotans, nice Minnesotans, tailgated on roads that are absolutely undrivable with blizzard conditions at the time where you can't really see in front of you either. Tailgated, like inches behind my car. Even on hills. According to the National Weather Service, it's going to go back to negative temperatures as soon as the snow is done.
Eden Prairie, snow and fog were reported with a temperature of 11. Around the state,
It's down to 11 already.
With a temperature of 3 at Mankato, 2 at Bemidji, 7 at International Falls, and 0 at Marshall.
0. It was about 20 degrees when I left. Now it's 11, no, something in that range. So I had to call work and tell them I don't know how I'm going to get there. You know, I've never missed a day of work for sickness in my adult life, and I've always, until now, had, salary jobs where I could take the day off without a problem or make up for it on the weekend. This is absolutely out of my control. This car is so beaten down. Nobody should be driving in this, least of all me. And the thing is, when you live in a car, this car is my home. When people are out there driving so reckless as these nice Minnesotans who tailgate me just inches behind my car, even in absolutely treacherous weather, the worst that can happen is, they smash up their car and maybe kill someone, get a new car out of it from the insurance. Their insurance goes up a bit, but they can show off their nice new car. Unless they kill too many people, then they might get a jail sentence. I don't know, in Minnesota. Because it's a lawless state. You see, that if you look at my videos, you'll see that the law isn't really regarded in this state. But when you live in a car, this is my home. I have to protect this like you would protect your home. If there's someone skulking around outside your home, what do? You turn off the lights, you call the police, you might get out the weapon, you get ready to defend your family and protect your home. This is my home. And for me to be out there with people who are this monumentally stupid is suicidal. I mean, if the car gets smashed, that's not the end of the world if you don't live in it. But if you live in it, it is the end of the world. Because then, instead of being in here where it's marginally warmer than 11 degrees, I'll be out there. You see. So I have to protect this car with my life, no matter what it costs, even if it costs me my job. Because it's my home. This is all I have. This is what keeps me from sleeping out there. So I guess I should say a word. Don't really want to be honest, but I guess I should say a word about the polar vortex. Ooh. So last week they had this polar vortex which descended upon America, and of course, this area, as far as I could tell, pretty much had the coldest temperatures in the whole country, continental country. I think Alaska was a bit colder, and we were much colder than Antarctica. Antarctica was much warmer than we are, but of course it's summer there. But still, it's Antarctica, and it was warmer there, you see. So I don't want to talk a lot about the polar vortex because I've just, I got enough battles to fight without taking on junk science. But it breaks my heart. I mean, It's this whole concept of, quote, a polar vortex. More junk science. They give it a name, they give it a title, they try to personalize it. Just like they're giving winter storms names now. They do everything they can to affect your emotions, but science is nowhere. You know, and by the same token, the people who just aren't really, they just don't believe in a polar vortex or climate change because they are against that whole liberal, progressive nonsense that pushes that junk. They haven't looked into the science, so they're correct by not believing in this nonsense, but they don't know why. So it's as good as if they're wrong anyway. So they'll say things like, "Oh, it's so cold out here. Thank you, global warming. Ha 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 ha. You know, it's 25 below zero. You know, there's global warming for you." And that's not a strong argument. That's not a scientific argument. But I can't get into the science here. I can't get into the history of politicized junk science. But the climate change, polar vortex nonsense is I mean, I'm sitting here listening to this thing, and sometimes I have to waste like 5 minutes while they go through the climate summary, which I could care less about. If I want that, I'll go look it up somewhere. I just want to know what the weather is. So I'll listen to this thing, and they'll say, you know, what the record cold was and the record high was. And most of the time, the records that were set were in 1886, whether it's cold or warm. 1923, 1975, 1994, 2010. They're all over the place. They're randomly distributed. All of these, and then when we break a record this particular year or some particular year, everyone looks at it and goes, "Oh, that's evidence of global warming or climate change or polar vortex or whatever." It's like, that isn't science. That's not the way it works. I learned about junk science when I was in graduate school because I loved science. Science was everything to me back then. Until I got into graduate school and I realized what a politicized pile of bunk it is. What they've done to science is sickening. And giving it some name like polar vortex, it's freaking cold is what it was. Sometimes that happens in the winter. It's hard to believe, but it was freaking cold. And for me in particular, it was pretty miserable because I live in a car, and guess what? The heater in my car went out right the day before the polar vortex. Now, I still had something that resembled heat. I think it's just the engine heat once it finally gets going. But I have to put my fingers up here, and all I do is just feel like a little blast. But the blower stopped working, so I had no heat. I couldn't defrost the windows or do anything. And frankly, it's still that way. I haven't been able to fix it. So during that incredible bitter cold with the holes in my car that equalizes the temperature outside, like I said, I just really don't want to talk about the polar vortex too much. What I will say is that my battery died for the first time since I got a new battery a few years ago. And as usual, it was pretty hard to find anyone who would help jump it. Even though I helped jump someone else's car, but getting a Minnesotan to help you was not the easiest thing in the world. I had to pull some strings to get some help where I was stranded out in that cold. And a nice guy finally did give me a jump start. Although I don't think he's from Minnesota. That's neither here nor there, isn't it? And so I actually found him later and gave him a gift card for pizza because I appreciated it. But, you know, a couple years ago when I had the battery that was dying all the time, like every single time it got cold, just down to zero, just to zero, the battery would die. And one time we were outside the church where they had that temporary shelter, and I'm out there and the battery died, and I'm just freezing. It's like 10 below zero. I'm just, I just like, you know, last week, just pain and suffering like you can't imagine. Just pain. That's all it is. Suffering. That's all it was. I'm in the parking lot of a church that had, until the day before, functioned as a temporary homeless shelter. So I go inside the church and I ask them to help me jumpstart my car. And all those people in this big church with, their balconies and their offices and all their showers and everything, they said no. They wouldn't help me jumpstart my car. You know why? Because the insurance company wouldn't like it. So I had to go back out to the car in the church parking lot and sit there and just shiver and freeze in sub-zero temperatures. Until another homeless person, I was able to raise him on the phone, and the homeless person came over and jumped me in the church parking lot about 40 feet away from the door. If anyone's been listening to my Christian rock mixes I've been putting up there, you'll notice that slide for the first 30 seconds or so where I talk about Minnesota churches. That's one of the reasons why. As if the insurance companies have, spy satellites and drones, and they're just flying over the parking lot watching to see if this church dares to jumpstart a homeless guy in sub-zero temperatures, bam, they're going to hit him with higher rates. And as if God would really mind if that happened. A church that cares would expect God to provide for them if the insurance company jacked up their rates because they went out and jump-started a homeless person's car. I'm just going to venture a guess here, but I think those people really just didn't care whether I lived or died. When they could have a little party for a couple of days hosting a temporary homeless shelter, and they could feel good about themselves, and then they could go to the warm homes and go tell all their friends over coffee about how they did something for the homeless. Maybe it wasn't as sincere as it originally appeared to be. Throughout in that same year, I had my the battery died many times, but I remember one time in particular, the last long video I did, I mentioned the Somalis out here. So I'm out there, I'm on enough of an incline where if I had a couple people easily push, I drive a stick so you can pop the clutch. Easily. It wasn't so bitter cold that the thing wouldn't turn over. And I'm on an incline. I did that on purpose, but I couldn't push it myself because I could smack into something. I had to be able to steer. And it's nighttime. It's like 11 or 12, and dark at night, just the street lights. And this group of Somalis, just young, healthy, strong young men come walking by. And I go out there and I say, hey, you guys mind helping give me a little push? I can push start the car and get this rolling. My battery's dead. And they just start laughing. No, man, you figure it out. You figure it out. As they walk over to their government-subsidized homes. All it would have taken was hardly any effort for them to just push this car, get it up to a little bit of speed, and I'm in business. I sat there that whole night because they wouldn't help. They're going to make wonderful Minnesotans. And yet for all this, with the polar vortex and the freezing cold, minus 20, 30, 40 degree wind chills, for all that, apparently it's not dangerous. Because the Minnesota Department of Health threw all those people at the hotel out into this weather. And they're the Department of Health, you see. So they care about health. They don't care about their own careers and themselves and them and me. And they care about other people, you see. That's why they threw the homeless people out into the cold the week before Christmas. Yeah, I know that's a tough argument to make. I'm sorry. That is a really tough argument to make. It almost seems more like they really just don't care if other people who are not them, if other people live or die, as long as they get to throw their weight around, they get to shut down a business that's trying to operate, they get to throw people out into the street, and then they get to go home and brag about it to their friends, about how they're saving the children. Department of Health. And excuse the interruption, but I have to interject here. While I was editing this video, I realized that I left something out. I did mean to mention the Donner Party, and if you look at my videos, I made a video about the Donner Party earlier. But the Donner Party was a pioneer group that moved from the Midwest to California back in 1846. and they did so on false pretenses. They were lied to. They were deceived by people who were profiting from lying to them, which is very similar to how I ended up in Minnesota. But what the Donner Party is known for is that they got trapped in a brutal, ruthless, cold snowstorm in 1846. And it was so bad that many of them died, and they had to resort to cannibalism to survive. And this was 1846. That's how bad that winter was. What, about 170 years later or so, these modern junk scientists are out there saying that something like this polar vortex is something new. That our ancestors never experienced this. You know, that it's getting worse and more often and more often and more often. It's a bunch of lies. All you have to do is look at history. Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. But they don't teach real history on television. They don't teach real history in schools. You got to study it. So as they talk about this polar vortex, don't let them snow you, so to speak. Our ancestors have had to deal with this stuff for way before the industrial age, before we emitted anything into the atmosphere other than flatulence. This is just absolutely ridiculous. The reason I'm freezing here, wondering if I'll survive this kind of weather, isn't because of climate change or global warming. It's because the people around me don't have the character anymore to help people who need help. That is what has changed. We have lost our souls. When Johann Kepler, Nicholas Copernicus, Isaac Newton, Maxwell, when all these truly great scientists, my heroes, these truly great scientists were doing their work, they didn't go out and do research and cook the books and pick and choose data and do meta-analyses to make sure that they got exactly the result that they wanted, no matter what the data was, which is what a meta-analysis is. Used by the anti-smoking industry, by the way. They're the ones who started this whole ridiculous junk science mess that we're in today. If you ever wonder why I talk about the anti-smoking movement all the time on here, it's because of that. It's because they set the precedent that could be hijacked by anybody with a social or political agenda. And that's exactly what happened. The anti-smokers learned how to change legitimate science into junk science to make sure that they got their agenda done. They could take control over other people's lives. They could tax them and steal their money. And there you go. Climate change follows the exact playbook that the anti-smokers set up. But back when you had Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo, these people just had a natural curiosity about the world that they lived in. They wanted to know how it worked. They weren't trying to set up some machine that would go out there and allow them to tax people and steal their money without working for a living or doing anything productive. They didn't do that. They just studied the real world using the techniques of legitimate science, the best they were able to. And they did amazing things. When's the last time we had a truly meaningful scientific discovery? Meaningful, not theory. And before I leave this segment, let me just mention one other thing. Whenever you see a news report supposedly about science, whether it's climate change or whatever, look for the keywords in there. The keywords are may, could, might, possibly. Climate change may result in blah, 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 blah. The polar vortex could blah, 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 blah. Scientists warn that such and such might happen. You know what? I could use a crystal ball to come up with that. There's no science there. Science isn't may, might, could, possibly, maybe, not quite sure. That's not science. 70% increased risk of blah, blah, blah. What does that even mean? That means absolutely nothing. A scientist tells you this will happen under these circumstances, period. Because that's natural law, and we have studied natural law and determined it. These people aren't scientists. They're junk scientists and they're social engineers. The reason this polar vortex is a threat to my life isn't because of science, it isn't because of climate change, it isn't because of what we're doing to the environment. It's because the people out there don't care about people as much as they used to. The Donner Party had people who put their lives at risk to go find them in those horrible blizzard conditions. And they stated the reason we did it is because if we don't, we will bring shame to our state and to our family names forever if we don't save those people. But that doesn't matter anymore. And that's why I'm talking to you from a car right now. Back to our regularly scheduled broadcast. The last thing I'd just like to mention here is kind of along those lines. This is for you, Department of Health of Minnesota. I ran across a video that reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in a while. I don't know when it was, 20, 25 years ago. Briefly dated a girl from Ukraine. And I remember one of the things she said early on, have you ever heard of Stalin? And yeah, I've heard of Stalin. Most people haven't. Minnesotans probably don't know who Stalin is, but yeah, I was very familiar with Stalin. Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, all the people who killed hundreds of millions of their own people, all the socialists / communists. It's the same thing, you see. It's just a matter of degree of how much the government controls and owns property. That's the difference between socialism and communism. I was perfectly aware of that. So when she brought that up, you know, she mentioned the sheer horror, and she could only refer to Stalin as a monster. The way, if you're not familiar with, among so many other horrific things this guy did, which almost makes what Germany did pale by comparison, although that's obviously not true. What Germany did was horrific as well in the Holocaust. But Stalin didn't like Ukraine. He didn't like the peasantry. He was very paranoid to begin with, but since this idiot, this useless farm boy bumpkin somehow rose to the top of the Politburo and became the leader of the Soviet Union, this nobody, you think a failed artist taking over Germany. Stalin was even less educated. I mean, just a madman. And he takes over the Soviet Union, and he's worried about a popular uprising. Popular meaning just average people not liking the way they're being treated and rising up and overthrowing him to put in something that might treat them a little better. So he decided, well, I'll just kill them all. You know, I mean, there are only 50 million of them. Why not just kill them all? So you might have heard of the gulags and things like that, but in Ukraine in particular, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, breadbasket of Europe. It was like, you know, Kansas, Nebraska would be in America, Iowa. He sent his goons down there to go into all the homes and confiscate all the food. Put the food on trucks and trains and take it away. And just left those people to starve to death. And Ukraine is also known for having winters that are pretty much like Minnesota winters. So no one knows how many millions of people died in that. It was a man-made famine. It was a Stalin-made famine. It was a socialist, communist-made famine. To get rid of people those who were in power, who were really the dregs of society to begin with, they were the ones in power. They didn't like all the other people. So they just wanted to kill them off. So they would take their food. And things were so bad that people had no food. They were eating. They were down to cannibalism. They were eating their own children. This event, no one's ever heard of, especially with the education system in Minnesota. I doubt they ever once, throughout 12 years of school, even hear the phrase Holodomor. You've heard of Holocaust. Holodomor is the man-made famine that killed off all those Ukrainians. Created by a socialist/communist government who just felt that because they were in power, they had the right to tell other people, to dictate whether other people lived or died. Kind of sounds like the Minnesota Department of Health, doesn't it? Just because they're in power. Just because. No other reason. Because there's no rational reason for what they did. Shutting down a hotel that was not a threat to anybody, and that was a life-saving place for many people. But you'll never hear of the Holodomor because the news won't report it. The news is bought and paid for by these leftists in America. You'll never hear the Holodomor in there. You'll never hear of it in our school system. And yet it was one of the largest genocides of the 20th century. And the 20th century was a century of genocides. If you're not familiar with Pol Pot and what Mao did, what Stalin did, what so many did. I mean, you can sit there and talk about what Americans did with the Native Americans, which was horrific. I'm totally opposed to what happened there. Oddly enough, the end of the Indian Wars happened right around here. Minnesota, North Dakota, that area. Remember Chief Joseph and all that? And after they had exterminated that race, for what it's worth, they settled here. Those are the people I'm relying on to stay alive, is the descendants of the people who committed the American genocide. So what I'd like to do is play for you just a brief clip. This is a clip of someone from their diary during this man-made famine in the Ukraine. So just listen to what they have to say. I'll let them do the talking. I'll do my best to attribute it. I hope I can find where I got it from so I can give them credit. My apologies if I'm not able to, but I want you to hear this, and then I'll just have one last thing to say after that.
Lesson number 1. Don't take anything for granted. My grandparents from my father's side came to America from Ukraine just before the Second World War and started a small farm in Texas where I grew up without missing a thing. But my grandfather wasn't so lucky. When he was only 12 and still in Ukraine, he survived one of the most horrific famines. Of the 100 families that lived on his street, only 20 survived. So what you're about to hear is a real recollection, as it was written in a personal journal just after the crisis by one of his neighbors. Where did all the bread disappear? I do not really know. Maybe they've taken it all abroad. The authorities have confiscated it, removed it from the villages, loaded grain into the railway coaches, and took it away someplace. They've searched the houses and taken away everything, to the smallest thing. All the vegetable gardens, all the cellars were raked out, and everything was taken away. It was so dreadful that every day became engraved in my memory. People were lying everywhere as dead flies. The stench was awful. Many of our neighbors and acquaintances from our street died. We tried to survive the best we could. We collected grass, goosefoot, burdocks, rotten potatoes, and made pancakes, soups from putrid beans or nettles, collected clay from the trees and ate it, ate sparrows, pigeons, cats, and dogs. When there were still cattle, it was eaten first, then the domestic animals. Some were eating their own children. I would never be able to eat my child. One of our neighbors came home when her husband, suffering from severe starvation, ate their own baby daughter. This woman went crazy. Another neighbor wrote a petition to the authorities, and here's just a paragraph from that. It said, "Please return the grain that you've confiscated from me. If you don't return it, I'll die. I'm 78 years old and I'm incapable of searching for food for myself." And of course, nobody cared. In a crisis, it's everyone for himself. Although in many cases, families did still remain families. But just after the winter, when there's absolutely nothing to eat, my grandfather, together with his mother, went to the nearest town where the government had established a soup kitchen. Unfortunately, the 25-mile journey was too much for his mother. After just 5 miles, she couldn't walk anymore. My grandfather noted in his journal, "Mother said, save yourself, run to town." I turned back twice. I could not bear to leave my mother, but she begged and cried, and I finally went for good. Now, I don't know about you guys. I'm a father myself, and when I read these things, I burst into tears. Now, please allow me to take a wild guess here, without getting mad at me. Your life's not perfect, but at least you have a computer or a mobile device to watch this video on. Your fridge is probably half full, and while you have your problems, starvation is not one of them. And even though your job or retirement could be more enjoyable, you probably have enough money to at least get by. And that's great. But make no mistake taking this for granted. History has shown us many times that it can all fly away in a split second. The biggest misstep that you can take now is to think that this can never happen in America or to you. All that my grandfather and our ancestors who came here and formed America lived through would be in vain without lesson number 2. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Okay, so that's what happened in Ukraine during that genocide. The man wrote to his government, told him he was starving, and he needed his food back, and he didn't even get a response. How does that relate to me? In these conditions, I wrote to 200 Minnesota legislators, every single one of them. I got 2 responses, which is more than that old gentleman got. One of them just said, "No thank you." The other one said, "Send me your home address so I can send you a written response to your email to me about your homelessness." You tell me what the difference is, fundamentally. What is the difference between the way that this leftist Minnesota is run and the way that genocidal maniac in the Soviet Union ran that place? That's all I got for you. I guess I'll just sit here and freeze some more. Thanks for watching.